One canteen of water can weigh more than 1,000 rifles. I learned that lesson in the Tunisian dust in 1943. For 3 days my tongue was a dry stone, and my world was iron silence. When the British tanks finally broke our line, I found no bullet. I found a gift that shattered every lie I had ever believed. The metallic taste at the canteen's rim was the first thing I truly felt, a cold shock against my split and bleeding lips. The water wasn't just liquid, it was a physical weight hitting my tongue, heavy and sweet as wine. I swallowed too fast, and a spasm of pain shot through my throat, which had been as dry as the scorched scrubland behind me. I wanted to plunge my face into a bucket of it, to drown in the coolness, but the British soldier held the base of the tin firmly, rationing the flow.
Steady on, Fritz. You'll have the lot down your tunic and none in your belly if you keep shaking like a leaf in a gale. Small sips. That's the trick.
I looked up at him, my eyes stinging from the salt that had crusted in my lashes. He wasn't the monster the officers in the barracks at Hamburg had described. He didn't have the face of a Bolshevik killer or a heartless imperialist. He looked like a baker's son from the Ruhr, with a face turned the color of a boiled beet by the African sun. His uniform smelled of grease, stale tobacco, and a strange, citrusy scent I would later learn was American soap. My own uniform was a second skin of filth, the fabric of my field gray tunic stiff enough to stand on its own, stinking of 3 days of fear and the copper tang of the blood on my sleeve.
There's the lad. Breathing again, are we? You lot look like you've been pulled through a knothole backwards. When was the last time your lot saw a supply truck?
I couldn't answer him, not because I didn't want to, but because my jaw felt as though it had been rusted shut. I simply stared at the webbing of his belt, at the polished brass, and the abundance of equipment he carried. He had more gear on his person than my entire squad had shared during the final retreat toward the coast. A hunger in my stomach wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a hollow, echoing void that made my lightheadedness feel like I was floating inches above the sand.
Right then. Let's get you on your pins. I haven't got all day to play nursemaid in this heat, and the sergeant's got a foul temper when the transport's late.
He reached down, grabbing my upper arm. His grip was like an iron vice, but it wasn't cruel. He pulled me upward, and for a terrifying second, the world turned into a dizzying swirl of yellow sand and white-hot sky. My knees, weakened by 72 hours of crouching in a foxhole with nothing but a handful of moldy hardtack, buckled instantly. I felt the rough wool of his sleeve against my face as he caught me, steadying my weight against his shoulder.
Easy, easy. I've got you. Blimey, you're nothing but bone and gristle, aren't you? You'd think the great Rommel could afford to feed his prize. Steers a bit better than this.
I leaned into him, the shame of my weakness momentarily eclipsed by the sheer necessity of his strength. The silence of the desert was gone now, replaced by the low, guttural growl of idling tank engines and the distant, rhythmic thud of a demolition charge. My boots, the leather cracked, and the soles worn thin as parchment, felt like lead weights as I tried to find my balance. Every movement was a chore, a slow-motion struggle against a body that had reached its absolute limit.
Can you walk? Or do I have to toss you over my shoulder like a sack of spuds? Come on, move those stumps. The lorries are just over that ridge, and they've got tea waiting. Though I wouldn't wish British Army tea on my worst enemy. It's wet and it's hot.
I forced my legs to move, one agonizing inch at a time. The sand crunched under my boots, a dry, mocking sound. I looked toward the ridge and saw them, dozens, hundreds of men in field grey, shuffling along like ghosts in a dream. We were a defeated army of scarecrows, being led away by men who seemed to have stepped out of a different world entirely, a world where there was enough water to wash, enough bread to share, and enough mercy to hold a falling enemy upright. As I stepped onto it, the transition from the dry, baking heat of the Tunisian sand to the humid, salt-heavy air of the harbor felt like crossing a threshold into another life. My boots, caked in the dust of a lost campaign, rang hollow against the metal. I kept my head down, the white POW stenciled on the back of my tunic, feeling like a cold hand pressing against my spine. I expected a shove, or the sharp bark of an American insult, but there was only the steady, rhythmic pulse of the ship's engines vibrating through the soles of my feet.
Keep it moving, Weber. Don't look at the water. Just keep your eyes on the man in front of you. One foot after the other, all the way down into the belly.
I glanced at him as I passed. He was leaning against a stanchion, casually tapping a pack of Lucky Strikes against his palm. He didn't look like the propaganda posters' depictions of the American subhuman. His face was clean-shaven. His skin lacked the sallow, translucent look of a man living on ersatz bread and sawdust. He looked like a man who had never known a day of real hunger in his life. The smell of his wool uniform was strange. Not the sour, vinegary stench of the Wehrmacht, but something citrusy and sharp, like laundry soap.
Watch your head, kid. The overheads are low. Welcome to the Waldorf Astoria of the Atlantic.
I descended the ladder into the hold. The air hit me like a physical blow. A thick, stagnant soup of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of rust. The light from the hatchway narrowed until it was just a silver coin high above us, and then the heavy iron covers were swung shut with a finality that made my heart hammer against my ribs. We were in total darkness for a moment, before the dim red battle lamps flickered to life, casting a bloody glow over rows of canvas bunks stacked 5 high. I found a bunk near the center of the hold. The canvas was taut and smelled of mildew. As I lay back, I felt the ship lurch. The engines increased their tempo, a deep, guttural roar that I felt in my teeth. We were moving. Somewhere out there, in the black expanses of the Atlantic, my own countrymen were waiting in their U-boats. I closed my eyes and could almost see the periscopes rising, the torpedoes being slid into their tubes. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I had spent 3 years cheering for the Grey Wolves as they strangled the Allied shipping lanes. Now, I was the cargo they were meant to sink.
All right, listen up. No smoking in the bunks. No shouting. We're going to be in this can for 17 days, so get comfortable with each other's smell. We'll bring down rations twice a day.
17 days. The thought was suffocating. Every creak of the hull sounded like a rivet popping. Every sudden thud of a wave against the bow sounded like the preamble to an explosion. I lay there, staring at the pipes, sweating condensation above my face, counting the seconds between the ship's rolls. I waited for the cold rush of seawater, for the scream of twisting metal.
I saw him flinch when the ship hit a heavy swell. I walked over and kicked the frame of his bunk lightly. Hey, relax. You're shaking the whole row. You want a piece of gum? It helps with the seasickness.
He held out a small foil-wrapped stick. I took it with trembling fingers, peeling back the silver paper. The scent of peppermint exploded in that rank, diesel-soaked air, a scent so clean and sharp it felt like a hallucination. I put it in my mouth, and the sweetness was overwhelming. It was a casual gesture for him, a trifle, but to me, it was a revelation. He had plenty. He had so much that he could give it to an enemy he was supposed to hate.
Get some sleep, Weber. The first night is always the worst. By the time we hit the mid-Atlantic, you'll be so bored you'll be praying for a torpedo just for the excitement.
He walked away, his flashlight beam dancing across the ceiling. I chewed the gum until the flavor was gone, but I kept the foil wrapper tucked into my pocket. It was the first piece of the new world I had ever touched, and as the ship groaned and plowed westward into the hunt, I realized with a growing, hollow dread that the men who owned such things, who gave away sugar and peppermint like it was salt, were not the monsters I had been promised. They were something far more dangerous. They were a people who had everything. The train car door groaned open, and for a moment I could not breathe. It was not the lack of air, but the weight of it. In the Libyan desert, the heat had been a sharp, dry blade that cut to the bone, but this Florida air was a wet wool blanket, heavy with the scent of salt, rotting vegetation, and something sweet and cloying like overripe fruit. I stepped onto the iron rungs of the ladder, my boots slick with the grease of the journey, and looked out at a horizon that was not yellow sand, but a violent, aggressive green. Palms with jagged, serrated fronds stood like sentries against a sky so blue it looked as though it had been scrubbed raw. My Africa Corps tunic, already stiff with the salt of my own sweat, felt like an insult against my skin.
He stood at the bottom of the steps, his helmet liner pushed back on his forehead to reveal a pale strip of skin where the sun hadn't reached. He didn't level his rifle at my chest. Instead, he leaned on it slightly, his thumb hooked into the webbed sling. "Watch your step, Weber. The humidity'll make a man lightheaded if he isn't used to it. Get in line over by the water tower and keep your hands where I can see them." He spoke with a slow, rhythmic drawl that sounded nothing like the harsh, clipped English I had heard in the newsreels in Berlin. There was no bark in his voice, no desire to see me flinch.
I moved into the shimmering heat, my feet crunching on white gravel that looked like crushed bone. The sun beat down on my blonde hair, which had turned the color of parched straw during the long months under Rommel. Ahead of me, a long line of my comrades stood in silence, their faces gaunt and hollow-cheeked, looking like ghosts haunted by the very uniforms they wore. We were marched toward a wooden table where a soldier stood with a bucket of black stenciling ink and a heavy brush. When I reached the front, he didn't look at my face. He grabbed the shoulder of my tunic, spun me around, and pressed a cold metal stencil against the small of my back.
He walked along the line, his boots clicking rhythmically against the gravel, watching as the black ink seeped into the grey wool of our jackets. "Steady now. Just a little something to make sure you don't get lost in the scrub. The PW stands for Prisoner of War, in case your English is as bad as my German. It's a permanent reminder of whose hospitality you're enjoying now." He pulled a pack of Lucky Strikes from his pocket, flipped one into his mouth with a practiced flick of his wrist, and struck a match on his thumbnail. The smell of the burning tobacco, rich and toasted, drifted over us like a taunt.
I felt the dampness of the fresh ink through the thin fabric, a heavy mark of shame that felt like it weighed more than the rifle I had carried in the desert. I looked at the back of the man in front of me. Hans, a boy from Munich who couldn't have been more than 19, and saw the large, stark white letters PW glaring back at me. We were no longer soldiers of the Reich. We were property, catalogued and branded. Yet, as Matthews exhaled a cloud of blue smoke, he didn't look at us with the burning hatred I had been told to expect from the American monsters. He looked at us with a sort of weary pity, as if we were nothing more than stray dogs he had been tasked with herding.
He gestured with the glowing cherry of his cigarette toward a row of long, low-slung buildings raised on concrete blocks. "Those are the barracks. Third one on the left is yours. Get your gear stowed, and don't go poking at the wire mesh on the windows. That's to keep the mosquitoes from eating you alive, not to keep you in. Trust me, you'd rather be in there than out here with the bugs." He wiped a bead of sweat from his chin and adjusted his belt, his movements loose and unhurried.
I walked toward the barracks, expecting the familiar stench of a crowded troop ship or the damp, moldy smell of a bunker. Instead, as I climbed the wooden steps and pushed open the door, I was met by the scent of fresh-cut pine and floor wax. I stopped in the doorway, my eyes widening. The windows were wide and covered in a fine, dark wire mesh screens. I ran a trembling finger over the tiny perfect squares of the weave. In the desert, we had fought for every inch of shade, and the flies had been a constant, crawling nightmare on our eyelids and lips. Here, the Americans had built a fortress against the insects just for their prisoners.
He stepped into the doorway behind me, the shadow of his tall frame falling across the polished floorboards. "What's the matter, Weber? Never seen a screen before?" We don't like being eaten by gnats in this country. He tapped the wall with the butt of his rifle, the wood sounding solid and thick. The roof don't leak, neither. We put the shingles on fresh last month. Better than a tent, I reckon.
I looked up at the ceiling, expecting to see the gaps and warped boards of a temporary shack. Instead, the wood was fitted together with a precision that spoke of an abundance of materials we hadn't seen in Germany for years. There were no water stains, no holes where the light of the sun could peek through. I sat down on the edge of a cot, the springs groaning under my weight, and realized with a sinking hollow dread that the war was already lost. A people who could afford to give their enemies screens and a dry roof were not a people who could be defeated. They were a people who had so much that they could afford to be kind to the very men who had tried to kill them. The humid air of Florida clung to my skin like a wet wool blanket, a heavy, suffocating dampness that was worlds away from the bone-dry, searing heat of the Tunisian desert. I climbed into the back of the GMC truck, my fingers catching on the rough, splintered wood of the tailgate, and felt the weight of the large white POW stenciled on my back, as if the letters themselves were made of lead. The metal floor of the truck bed vibrated beneath my boots, humming with the rhythmic thrum of a powerful engine that didn't sputter or cough, fueled by a reservoir of gasoline that seemed, like everything else in this country, inexhaustible. I slid onto the wooden bench, my spine aching, and looked out at the passing landscape of Camp Blanding as we began to move.
He sat directly across from me, his back against the cab, his long legs stretched out so that his scuffed brown combat boots nearly touched my own. He didn't look like the monsters the propaganda films in Berlin had depicted. He looked like a farm boy who had grown too tall for his Sunday suit. His uniform was clean, the olive drab fabric thick and sturdy, lacking the frayed edges and sweat-stained salt rings that had defined every piece of clothing I had owned for the last 2 years. He didn't point his N1 GAR at my chest. Instead, he leaned the rifle casually against the slat side of the truck, the barrel angled away as if I were a passenger rather than a prisoner who had once been sworn to his destruction.
I watched the pine trees flickering past, a blur of deep, vibrant green that hurt my eyes after months of staring at the monochromatic tan of the Sahara. The air was thick with the scent of resin and damp earth, a smell so fertile it felt like something I could chew. My stomach gave a low, traitorous growl. I pressed my palms against my gaunt thighs, trying to ignore the hollowness in my gut, and turned my gaze back to the corporal. I expected to see the cold, triumphalist stare of a conqueror, or perhaps the sharp, jagged edge of institutionalized hatred. I looked for the spark of the enemy, but all I found was a young man squinting against the Florida sun.
He reached into the deep pocket of his fatigue jacket and pulled out a sphere of brilliant, shocking orange. It was so bright it looked artificial, a globule of fallen sun captured in the palm of his hand. He didn't look at me as he took a small pocket knife from his belt and began to score the rind. The scent hit me a second later, a sharp, acidic spray of citrus oil that cut through the heavy smell of diesel fumes and pine. It was a fragrance I hadn't smelled since a Christmas long before the war, a scent of luxury and peace that felt almost violent in its intensity.
I could not stop staring. My eyes were fixed on his steady hands as he tucked his thumb under the skin of the fruit, peeling back thick, pithy strips to reveal the weeping, succulent meat beneath. The juice glistened on his calloused fingertips, and for a moment, the roar of the truck's engine faded into a dull roar in my ears. I thought of the rations we had scavenged in the desert, the hard tack that tasted like sawdust, the lukewarm water that smelled of oil drums. Here, in the back of a transport truck, in the middle of a swamp, this American was treating a piece of fruit like it was nothing more than a common stone.
He noticed my gaze, his blue eyes shifting from the orange to my face. I stiffened my shoulders, squaring instinctively, waiting for the sharp bark of an order or the mocking laugh of a man who knew I was starving. He didn't say a word. He didn't even smile. He simply broke the orange in half with a wet, tearing sound, the segments separating with an ease that felt like a miracle. He held out the larger half toward me, his hand steady despite the bouncing of the truck over the sandy ruts of the road.
I hesitated, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The PW on my back felt like a brand of shame, yet his outstretched hand offered something that transcended the war. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and took the fruit from him. The skin was cool and waxy, the weight of it substantial in my palm. As I pulled a segment free and pressed it against my tongue, the explosion of sweetness was so overwhelming it brought tears to my eyes. It wasn't just the sugar, it was the casualness of the gift. They had so much of everything: gasoline, wood, steel, and even kindness, that they could afford to give it away to the very men who had tried to burn their world down. I swallowed the juice, feeling it coat my parched throat, and realized with a terrifying clarity that we had never stood a chance against a people who fought with such abundance. The sticky residue of the orange juice remained on my fingers, a sweet, tacky reminder of a world that didn't run on ersatz sawdust, bread, and scorched earth. I wiped my hand against the rough wool of my trousers, but the scent lingered. Citrus and sunshine, sharp enough to cut through the heavy, humid air of the Florida woods. Above us, the cicadas buzzed with a rhythmic, mechanical intensity that sounded like the cooling engines of a panzer, yet there was no heat of battle here, only the oppressive wet heat of the swamp. My field-gray tunic, salt-crusted and stiff, felt like a suit of lead armor. The white PW, stenciled on my back, seemed to pull at my spine, a mark of shame that felt lighter with every step I took toward the shimmering blue horizon, peeking through the pines.
Keep your boots moving, Weber. The water isn't going to get any colder the longer you stare at it. He adjusted the brim of his tan service cap, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple with the back of a hand that held no weapon at the moment. His rifle was slung casually over his shoulder, the muzzle pointing toward the canopy of longleaf pines rather than at my heart. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver tin, and the distinct clinking sound of metal on metal echoed in the stillness.
I watched his hands. They were thick-fingered and calloused, the hands of a man who knew labor, yet he handled the small tin of tobacco with a gentleness that baffled me. In the Reich, everything was sharp, everything was urgent. Here, time seemed to stretch and sag like a wet clothesline. The scent of fresh pine needles crushed under our boots mixed with the briny, stagnant smell of the lakeshore ahead. It was a smell of life and decay all at once, a far cry from the metallic, burnt oil stench of the Afrika Korps camps. My lungs felt tight, not from the exertion, but from the sheer volume of oxygen in this humid paradise.
You ever see a lake this big back in the old country? Or were you too busy marching in straight lines to look at the water? He thumbed a match into flame, the sulphurous pop sharp in the quiet air. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, the blue smoke curling upward to disappear into the moss-strapped branches above. He didn't look at me with the eyes of a victor looking at the vanquished. He looked at me like a foreman looks at a tired hand at the end of a long shift.
I shook my head slowly, my neck popping with the effort. We have lakes, Corporal, but the air, it does not feel like a warm blanket there. It is thin, cold. I looked down at my boots, the leather cracked and gray from the desert sun. Every step toward the water's edge felt like a step further away from the man I was supposed to be. I was a soldier of the Third Reich, a defender of a 1,000-year destiny, yet I was salivating at the thought of a bath and an American cigarette. The absurdity of it was a physical weight in my chest.
Well, wrap your head around this, Weber. Today you aren't a soldier, you're just another hot, miserable soul in Florida. He gestured with his cigarette toward the clearing. The trees opened up, revealing the lake, a vast sapphire mirror reflecting the relentless sun. A group of American soldiers were already there, their uniforms tossed in messy heaps upon the sand. They were splashing, shouting, their voices carrying across the water with a frantic, joyful energy that felt alien to me.
The sound of their laughter hit me before the sight of the water did. It was a high, bright sound, unburdened by the shadow of the gallows or the front lines. I stopped at the edge of the sand, the heat of the white grains radiating through my thin soles. I could smell the lake now, the scent of algae, wet sand, and the faint, sweet perfume of wild lilies. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird seeking exit. I looked at the POW on my sleeve, then at the Americans in the water. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like boys. They looked like me if I had been born in Ohio instead of Bavaria.
Don't just stand there like a statue, kid. Strip down. The US Army doesn't provide laundry service for submerged Nazis. He let out a short, dry chuckle and leaned against the trunk of a cypress tree, crossing his ankles. He looked perfectly at ease, a man who had more than enough of everything, even time.
I reached for the buttons of my tunic, my fingers trembling. The metal was hot to the touch. As I unburdened myself of the wool, the heavy, sweat-soaked fabric falling to the sand, I felt a strange, terrifying lightness. The air hit my pale, gaunt chest, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a cog in a machine. I felt like a man, standing on the edge of the world, watching the end of an era wash away in the ripples of a Florida lake. I waded in, the mud squelching between my toes, the cool water rising to meet my knees, then my thighs, a liquid mercy that didn't care which side of the wire I was born on. The water was a heavy, cooling weight against my ribs, a stark contrast to the parched, cracking heat of the Tunisian desert that still seemed to live in the marrow of my bones. I let myself sink until the surface tension tickled my chin, the Florida lake reflecting a sky so blue it looked painted devoid of the oily black plumes of burning Panzer IV.
Don't go drifting off too far, Weber. I'm not in the mood to go for a swim just to fetch a prisoner back to the wire.
I looked back toward the shore, squinting against the glare, and saw the corporal leaning against a cypress tree with his boots crossed at the ankles. He held his M1 Garand with a casual negligence that would have earned a German sentry a week in the stockade. Yet there was no malice in his posture, only the bored patience of a man who knew the war was already decided.
Take your time, I suppose. The mosquitoes aren't biting yet, and that sun feels better than a heater in a Kansas winter.
I dipped my head beneath the surface, letting the muffled silence of the underwater world drown out the hum of the camp and the distant rumble of transport trucks. When I closed my eyes, I wasn't in Florida anymore. I was standing on the deck of the transport ship in Norfolk, Virginia. Just 2 weeks ago, watching the American coastline emerge from the morning mist like a waking giant.
You okay under there? Or did you find a turtle to talk to?
I broke the surface, gasping, the water sheeting off my gaunt face and over the stenciled PW on my discarded tunic, lying on the bank. I remembered the pier at Norfolk, the way the gangplank had rattled under my boots, and the paralyzing shock of what I saw there. There were no craters in the concrete, no jagged skeletons of bombed-out buildings, and no hollow-eyed women scavenging through rubble for a handful of coal.
You've got that look again, the one where you look like you're trying to count the stars in the middle of the afternoon.
I ignored the comment, my mind fixated on the rows upon rows of GMC trucks I had seen lined up at the docks, thousands of them, their olive-drab paint gleaming in the sun, smelling of fresh rubber and high-octane gasoline. In the Africa Corps, we had shared a single canteen of oily water between 3 men and scavenged parts from wrecked British lorries just to keep our engines turning. But here, the Americans had enough steel to pave the world.
We've got plenty more where those came from, Weber. My brother works the assembly line in Detroit. Says they don't even turn the lights off at the factory anymore.
The realization had hit me then, standing on that pier, as a young American dock worker had tossed me a red, delicious apple simply because he saw me staring. The fruit had been cold, crisp, and sweet, a luxury I hadn't tasted in years. given to me by a monster who didn't even bother to sneer at my uniform. We had been told they were a decadent, weak people, yet their industrial might was a suffocating shroud, a mechanical tide that no amount of German will could ever hope to stem.
Eat your fill of the air, son. It's the only thing in this country we don't charge you for.
I waded back toward the shore, the mud squelching between my toes, feeling the terrifying lightness of a man who finally understands he has been fighting a ghost. The monsters possessed a casual kindness that was more devastating than any artillery barrage. They could afford to be human because they possessed everything else. I reached for my dusty field gray tunic, the fabric feeling like a leaden weight, a relic of a country that was currently being ground into the dust by the very abundance I saw surrounding me in this strange, beautiful, and impossible land. I folded that field gray tunic for the last time, many decades ago, yet the weight of it still settles on my heart whenever the house grows quiet. It is a strange, sobering thing to realize your enemy was never a monster, but merely a man with a surplus of kindness you were told didn't exist. That afternoon by the lake, the simple juice of a stranger's orange did more to defeat the Reich than any artillery barrage ever could. It reminded me that we are always more than the flags we are forced to serve. These stories are all that remain of a world that nearly burned itself to ash. We share them so the humanity of that generation is never forgotten. If you believe these memories should be preserved, please subscribe to help us keep them alive. The characters, incidents, and dialogue in this video are dramatized for narrative and entertainment effect. While some events may be inspired by real-life themes, this story is a work of fiction.